In 1945, the sun hung low over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the desolate airfields. For the men on the ground, the war had ended, but the emptiness left in its wake was suffocating. Major Jack Collins stood at the edge of the runway, watching the last few planes depart, their engines a fading hum in the distance. He had been stationed here on the remote island of Tinian for nearly 3 years, overseeing the construction of an airbase that had supported some of the fiercest battles of the Pacific. But now, with the enemy vanquished, there was nothing left to do but wait. It was the strangest feeling, a profound silence that seemed to stretch for miles. It wasn't just the planes that had gone. It was the very heartbeat of the island itself. The hum of machines, the shouts of soldiers, the frantic energy of war. All of it had evaporated in a single moment of peace. Jack wasn't sure what he was feeling. The war had been won, the flags were raised, the victories were celebrated. But what now? He had overseen the creation of this base from scratch, watching as barren land transformed into a thriving military hub capable of fueling an entire fleet. Now that purpose was gone, and with it, the question lingered like a dark cloud. What was to become of the sprawling network of bases that stretched from the frozen waters of the Arctic to the sweltering jungles of the South Pacific? Thousands of miles of infrastructure, built in a matter of months, now stood abandoned, its value uncertain. It wasn't just Tinian, of course. Across the globe, men like Jack were confronting the same impossible question. Bases that had been hastily constructed to serve the insatiable demands of war now sat empty, their once proud fortifications quietly eroding in the sun. The United States had built a military empire unlike any the world had ever seen, with over 400 major installations. They had been designed for a singular purpose, to defeat the enemy, no matter the cost. But now the cost seemed irrelevant. Victory had been achieved, but there was no plan for what came after. No roadmap for what to do with the vast, expensive network that had powered the war effort. As Jack stood there, his boots crunching in the dust, he couldn't help but feel like a man adrift. There were decisions to be made, decisions that would define not just the future of these installations, but the future of America itself. It wasn't just about closing down operations. It was about the very soul of the nation. How could a country victorious in war just walk away from this monumental achievement? What did it mean for America to leave these massive structures behind? Was it a sign of humility or a symbol of retreat? Jack's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a jeep rolling up behind him. He turned to see Captain Helen Davis, a no-nonsense officer who had worked alongside him throughout the construction of the base. She wasn't the type to waste words, but today, her face betrayed the weight of the situation. "Major," she said, her voice tight with the tension of the moment. "Orders have come through. We start packing up in the morning. Everything goes to surplus or it gets dismantled." "Just like that?" Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might make the whole thing feel more real. Helen nodded, her gaze distant. "Just like that. The war's over. We're out of here. No time to look back." She paused, then added softly, "No time to think about what all this means." Jack glanced back at the runways, now silent. The planes were gone, the hangars empty, the men who had built this place scattered to the winds. The war had ended, and with it, so too had the purpose of everything they had fought for. But what about all the lives, the sweat, the millions of dollars, the resources? What would become of it all? The problem wasn't just logistical. It was psychological. These bases had been symbols of American strength, built in a time of crisis, when every resource had been funneled into the war effort. The question wasn't just about the cost of keeping them open, or even the difficulty of decommissioning them. It was about what they represented. What did America do with its power when the fight was over? What did it mean to have won so decisively and yet be left with the remnants of war scattered across the globe? As Jack climbed into the jeep, the weight of the future pressed down on him like the heat of the midday sun. The world had changed, but there was no manual for what came next. No instructions on how to let go of what they had built. The war was over, but the true battle was just beginning. The questions that lingered were the hardest of all. What would America do with its empire of bases now that there was no war to fight? And perhaps more pressing, what would become of them? Would they stand as reminders of a time when America had ruled the oceans, the skies, the earth? Or would they, too, fade into history, left to decay in the silence of peace? Jack didn't know. All he knew was that the end of the war had not brought the peace they had all expected. It had brought a new kind of war, a quiet, insidious struggle over what to do with the legacy of victory. And as the jeep sped away from the runway, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest decisions were yet to come. The war had been a machine, ruthless and unstoppable, and at its heart were the vast, sprawling bases built across the globe. Over 400 of them, constructed in the blink of an eye, to serve one singular purpose: victory. Each base was a cog in the American war effort, an intricate piece of a larger whole that spanned oceans, jungles, and frozen tundras. They rose from the earth like monuments to the nation's resolve, fortresses of steel and concrete, built with an urgency that left little room for contemplation. The question of what to do with them after the war was the last thing on anyone's mind. The battle was always the focus, and so these bases were born of necessity, without a thought to their future. The scale of it all was staggering. Massive naval bases, built to support entire fleets, towered over once quiet islands, their docks stretching out into the sea like fingers reaching for power. These were the crown jewels of American military infrastructure. Fortresses capable of housing thousands of men, endless supplies, and fleets of warships. The base at Pearl Harbor had been the focal point of the Pacific theater, but even it had been dwarfed by the incredible size of the new installations. At Ulithi, in the Caroline Islands, a once-forgotten anchorage had transformed into a bustling fleet base capable of housing more than 600 ships, with floating dry docks, massive fuel reserves, and a harbor that could shelter the entire Pacific fleet. These were not just bases. They were self-contained cities built on the back of blood and sweat, designed for a war that demanded everything. But for every grand naval base, there were also the crude, hastily assembled outposts that dotted the map. Smaller islands, often nothing more than specks of land in the vastness of the Pacific, were transformed into outposts to support the war effort. These bases were barely more than skeletons: fuel bladders, ammo stockpiles, and Quonset huts made of prefabricated materials, thrown together in a matter of weeks. These were the forgotten corners of the war, where men lived under constant threat of isolation, the urgency of construction far outpacing any comfort or permanence. Yet they were critical, each one supporting operations that would ultimately secure victory. The costs were unfathomable. The United States had poured millions into this infrastructure, with the figure reaching over $12 billion, an amount equivalent to the building of entire cities. The manpower required was staggering as well. Over 2 million workers had been mobilized at the peak of the war effort. These were not just soldiers. They were the engineers, laborers, and construction crews who transformed barren lands into operational military hubs. Entire battalions of workers had carved bases out of the jungle, turned coral reefs into docks, and constructed roads in the most inhospitable of environments. The work had been brutal, a constant race against time. These men had built the war machine with a single-minded focus, knowing that their work would determine the outcome of the conflict. But now, as the war came to a close, that machine was quiet. The docks once filled with ships were now empty, the airstrips unused. The men who had built these fortresses returned home, leaving behind the remnants of their labor. Vast complexes now hollowed out, their purpose lost. For the grand installations, it was a stark contrast. They were like monuments, silent reminders of a time when they were the beating heart of the war effort. But for the smaller, more temporary bases, the situation was even more dire. The very nature of their construction left them vulnerable to decay. These were outposts that had been thrown together with expedience, their fragility now laid bare as the war ended. The infrastructure of victory was now in limbo, abandoned like forgotten ships that had long since sailed. And so the question arose, what would become of all this? The enormity of it could not be understated. These bases had been built for a singular purpose, But what purpose could they serve now that the world had changed? The vast infrastructure that had once been a symbol of American might now stood as a testament to the fleeting nature of power. Would these structures fade into obscurity, left to rust and crumble? Or would they find new life in a world that no longer needed them? The military leaders who had overseen their construction had no answer. They had been trained to win wars, not to manage peace. What they had built was incredible, but it was also a dilemma, a burden that could no longer be carried in the same way. The sheer scale of the network demanded a reckoning, and that reckoning would shape not only the future of the military, but the future of the nation itself. For now, though, the bases stood in silence, monuments to a victory that was no longer needed. And the world, for the first time in years, had to confront the most uncomfortable question of all. What do you do when the war ends, but the infrastructure of victory remains? Victory didn't come with a manual. The war had ended, the enemy defeated, and yet, for all its glory, victory carried with it an uncomfortable truth. What do you do with all this power? The United States had built a military empire of unprecedented scale, a vast network of bases that stretched from the frozen wastes of the Arctic to the sweltering heat of the South Pacific. They had been necessary for the war effort, but now, with the battle over and the dust settling, the question loomed larger than ever. What was to become of them? The urgency to make a decision came fast. There were no celebrations of the empire the U.S. had constructed, only a rush to reduce, consolidate, and, for many of the outposts, abandon them altogether. The initial response was swift, almost surgical. The war was won, and the demand for demobilization grew louder by the day. America had poured countless resources into the war effort, and now there was a cry to shift gears, to take that energy and return it to civilian life. The public demanded it. The economy demanded it. It was time to shrink the military machine and begin rebuilding the nation. But the enormity of the task was overwhelming. The Pentagon had to make decisions quickly. Bases that had once been vital to the war effort were now costly burdens. With millions of soldiers returning home, there was no longer the manpower to maintain them. Thousands of troops were being demobilized, and the country was preparing for a return to peacetime footing. The rapid demobilization was a necessity, but it also created an urgent dilemma. The infrastructure that had fueled victory was now seen as a drain, excess, costly, and largely redundant. As the bases were evacuated, the scale of the challenge became clearer. The facilities that had been built with wartime expediency were now on the chopping block, their future uncertain. Bases that had once hummed with activity stood silent, their assets either sold, dismantled, or discarded. The material costs were staggering, and the pressure was mounting. More than 100 bases had already been slated for closure by the end of 1945, a massive logistical operation to pack up and send everything, tens of millions of dollars worth of equipment, back to the United States or to find buyers in the civilian market. Quonset huts, once the homes of soldiers and airmen, were now being dismantled, shipped off or sold as surplus. Fuel reserves were moved, scrap metal collected, and every piece of equipment that could be salvaged was sent to other bases or the War Assets Administration. But even in the haste of closure, there was hesitation. The growing threat of the Soviet Union cast a shadow over the process. The world had changed. A new power was rising in the East, and the specter of communism was looming. As the United States began to retract, the Cold War was just beginning. The political landscape was shifting again, and military planners couldn't ignore the possibility that America's reduced presence might create an opening for Soviet influence. There was a growing sense that the need for American military power might not be as fleeting as the end of the war suggested. Strategic minds began to push back against the tide of demobilization. The U.S. might have defeated Japan and Germany, but the war had revealed just how precarious the global order had become. The idea of a complete withdrawal from overseas bases was no longer as appealing as it had once been. While the country demanded peace, the global reality was shifting, communism was spreading, and the U.S. had an obligation to maintain a strategic presence to contain this new threat. The United States had already begun to experience the first stirrings of what would become a Cold War conflict, and military leaders knew that some of these bases might be needed again, not for a war of armies, but for a battle of ideologies. So, the decision wasn't as simple as closing the bases and moving on. The immediate response to demobilize had collided with the emerging threat of Soviet expansion. Some bases, those deemed strategically important, were kept open or earmarked for future reactivation. The urgency of closure began to slow as leaders realized that power, American power, might still need a place to operate from in the coming decades. Bases like Pearl Harbor, Guam, and Okinawa, once considered extraneous in the post-war world, were now essential for maintaining the global balance. The cost of maintaining these bases was immense, but the cost of not maintaining them could be even greater. The military leadership found itself caught between two competing forces: the public's demand for peace and demobilization, and the emerging reality of a new world order, one that would require a global military presence to keep America safe from the spreading influence of the Soviet Union. The decisions made in these early post-war years would shape not only the future of American military strategy, but the future of the world itself. The tension was palpable. Should America retreat, as the public seemed to want, leaving a void for other powers to fill? Or should it hold firm, consolidating its position, and preparing for the ideological war that loomed just over the horizon? Victory had been achieved, but the battle for America's place in the post-war world had only just begun. And as the question of what to do with all this power hung in the air, the country found itself on the precipice of a new conflict, one that would test not only its military might but its very ideals. Islands once alive with the machinery of war now stand deserted. The sounds of hammering, the shouts of soldiers, the roar of engines, all have faded into silence. The Pacific, once the stage for some of the most brutal and relentless battles of the war, was now a ghostly landscape, scattered with the remains of bases that had been built at breakneck speed to secure victory. These remote islands, once humming with activity, now stood still, their abandoned airfields and empty Quonset huts fading into the salt and sand. It was an eerie emptiness, a hollow reminder of a war that had consumed everything. In the distance, Major Jack Collins found himself once again standing at the edge of the runway on Tinian. But this time, there were no planes, no troops, no constant buzz of activity. Just the wind and the remnants of what had once been a vital piece of the war effort. The concrete slabs where planes had once touched down were now cracked and weathered, the hangars left to rot, their roofs caving in. The island that had played a crucial role in the defeat of Japan was now a hollow shell, a place where time had stopped. The men who had built this base, who had worked tirelessly day and night, had long since departed, and with them the pulse of war had left the land. As Jack looked out over the remains of Tinian's airstrip, he couldn't shake the feeling that something intangible had been lost. The island was no longer just a place, it had become a symbol of the devastation left behind by victory, the emotional and psychological cost of war. These bases, built with such urgency and zeal, now stood as eerie reminders of the price of war. The empty structures, once so full of purpose, seemed to haunt the island. The ghost of conflict lingered, refusing to fade away. And in that silence, Jack realized that the abandonment of these places was not just a logistical decision, it was a psychological one. It was as if the island itself had become a graveyard of ambition, a place where the ghosts of the past refused to let go. Tinian, like so many other islands in the Pacific, had been a temporary home, a place where men had lived and died for a cause that now seemed so far away. The haste with which the base had been built was mirrored in the speed with which it was abandoned. And yet, in the rush to dismantle, there was no room for closure. No time to reflect on the cost, the lives lost, the work done. The islands were left to weather the storms of time, forgotten by all but the few who had once walked their shores. The psychological toll of leaving these places behind was not just felt by those who had built them, but by the nation as a whole. These bases represented not just a military presence, but an American empire, a symbol of unmatched power and reach. To abandon them was to confront the painful reality that what had been built with so much blood and sweat had no place in the New World Order. The loss of these islands was a loss of identity, a reminder that nothing built for war lasts forever. And yet, despite the silence, the ghosts remained. The remnants of the war machine, now decaying and forgotten, seemed to whisper of what had been and what could never be again. The ghost of war hung in the air, a spectral reminder of a time when America's reach seemed limitless. What do you do when your empire, built on military might, suddenly becomes irrelevant? Can power truly be discarded? The question weighed heavily on those left to make the decisions in the immediate aftermath of World War II. America had risen to global prominence on the back of its military prowess, its network of bases sprawling across continents and oceans. But with the end of the war, the sudden transition to peace left a country struggling to reconcile its newfound position in the world. What had once seemed an unstoppable force now felt out of place in the new reality of post-war politics. The decision to close or abandon bases was not just a logistical one. It was an emotional one, a psychological reckoning with the very nature of American power. These bases had been built in a time of unparalleled urgency, each one a testament to the nation's ambition and military dominance. But with the war over and the Cold War looming on the horizon, the emotional weight of shutting them down was palpable. The decision felt like the end of an era, a loss of something essential to the national identity. For so long, the United States had been a military power, a force that could project its might anywhere on the globe. Now, that empire seemed fragile, vulnerable to the changing tides of geopolitics. The symbolic abandonment of these bases was a wound that ran deep. Military pride, once intertwined with the sheer scale of America's global presence, now seemed at odds with the pragmatism of peace. Resources that had been poured into the creation and maintenance of these bases were now seen as wasteful, a relic of a time when the world was defined by war. As bases were closed and abandoned, the sense of loss was not just about physical structures. It was about the idea of American dominance. The question wasn't just about maintaining military strength. It was about what it meant to be a global superpower in a world that was rapidly changing. As the U.S. shifted its focus from war to rebuilding, the psychological toll of letting go was immense. For a country that had built its identity on military power, retreating from these far-flung bases felt like a surrender, not just of land or resources, but of its own self-perception. The U.S. had been built on the idea of power, on the idea that it could protect its interests anywhere in the world. To abandon these bases was to confront the uncomfortable truth that the American empire, built on military might, no longer fit into the new global order. Yet, even as the U.S. began to reduce its presence around the world, the echoes of that empire remained. The shifting dynamics of the Cold War demanded a new kind of power projection, one less about occupying territory and more about political influence. As the Soviet Union rose as the new global threat, America's focus would shift from military bases to ideological battles, but the emotional weight of those abandoned bases would linger. The decision to close or maintain them was symbolic of the larger struggle between national pride and the realities of a changing world. The legacy of these bases, these monuments to American power, would not disappear easily. They would be remembered not just as military outposts, but as a reflection of a time when America's global reach seemed infinite. The process of closing them was not just about physical space. It was about the space that was left behind in the American psyche. A space filled with loss, with uncertainty, and with the growing realization that the world had changed. The empire built on military might had become irrelevant. But could power truly be discarded? Or would it haunt America's future, shaping the decisions and struggles to come? From rapid reduction to strategic retention, America's approach to the post-war base crisis was anything but simple. The task of disentangling itself from a global network of military bases was as complex as the war that had necessitated their construction in the first place. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the U.S. found itself confronting an overwhelming reality. There were far too many bases, too much military infrastructure, and not enough resources to maintain it all. The first phase, marked by immediate reductions, was swift and brutal. Bases that had once been the lifeblood of the war effort were now deemed redundant. Their personnel swiftly evacuated, and their operations halted. The urgency of demobilization made it clear the American military machine was in full retreat. Yet, the second phase of withdrawal was not as simple. The looming shadow of the Soviet Union, the rising tensions of the Cold War, and the realization that power on a global scale could not be abandoned so hastily led to the emergence of a strategic retention plan. Some bases, far from being closed, were expanded or upgraded, retained as outposts of American influence in a world teetering on the brink of ideological warfare. Pearl Harbor, Guam, and a handful of other strategically significant bases would become the cornerstone of the U.S. military's ability to project power in the Pacific and beyond. The third and final phase was the most complicated. As the U.S. sought to close down or transfer smaller, less critical bases, it encountered the complexities of foreign agreements, local politics, and economic realities. Some bases, once located on islands now under dispute, had to be negotiated and transferred. Others were sold off with materials and equipment stripped for reuse. In a few cases, bases were mothballed in place, left dormant, waiting for a time when their strategic value might rise again. The work of reducing the American military footprint was far from over, but it was clear that some locations, while deemed unnecessary in the immediate post-war world, would prove to be essential in the decades to come. The United States had begun to transition from a wartime empire to a strategic one, and its military presence, though smaller in scope, would remain an enduring symbol of power and influence. At what cost does one dismantle an empire? The wreckage of war is not just physical. It's emotional, psychological, and financial. The decision to abandon or close military bases was fraught with unforeseen consequences, logistical, environmental, and economic. As thousands of men and women were sent home, and the infrastructure they had built was left behind, the cost of dismantling this empire became clear. Salvaging what could be reused and disposing of the rest was a monumental task. The Navy, in particular, took on the responsibility of mothballing bases, preserving them in a state of suspended animation, hoping that in the future they could be revived if needed. Equipment that could not be moved or repurposed was simply abandoned, left to rot in the elements or destroyed. The environmental cost of these closures was significant, though it would take decades for the full consequences to be understood. Fuel tanks left behind at abandoned bases leached into the ground, and contaminated sites became a lingering reminder of the war's toll. The Navy's salvage efforts were focused on what could be salvaged: metal, machinery, building materials, but much of the infrastructure was simply left to fall apart. In some cases, entire communities that had sprung up around these military bases were left in economic limbo. The rapid reduction of U.S. military presence left civilian populations in places like the Pacific Islands scrambling to adapt. For these communities, the presence of American bases had meant jobs, growth, and prosperity. But now, as the military withdrew, they were left with decaying remnants of an empire that had once supported them. On some islands, the abandoned bases became haunting reminders of a past that had vanished. The economic toll on local economies was immense, but the psychological toll of abandonment was just as severe. For the soldiers who had once manned these bases, the emotional cost of leaving behind the places they had lived and fought was profound. The infrastructure they had built, often with sweat and sacrifice, was now being left to disintegrate. The cost of abandonment wasn't just in dollars. It was in the loss of purpose, of identity, and of the memory of a war that had defined their lives. The war was over, but the Cold War had just begun. What does peace really mean when the new enemy is invisible, but just as dangerous? As the U.S. began its post-war withdrawal from military bases, the sudden rise of the Soviet Union forced a reevaluation of the country's global military posture. What had once seemed like an inevitable reduction of military presence now faced a stark reversal. The Cold War was not fought with bombs and bullets alone. It was a war of influence, of strategic positioning, and of maintaining a global presence to contain the spread of communism. America's bases, many of which had been hastily closed or mothballed, now became critical in the emerging superpower rivalry. Pearl Harbor, Guam, and Okinawa, bases once considered relics of a bygone era, were rapidly reactivated or expanded to serve as outposts in a new kind of conflict. The U.S. military, now focused on the containment of Soviet power, found that these once-abandoned bases were not just important, they were essential. These bases were no longer just symbols of wartime dominance. They became the lifeblood of America's strategic presence in the Pacific, Europe, and beyond. The psychological shift was profound. Where once the end of the war had promised a return to civilian life, now the specter of the Cold War demanded that these military outposts remain a permanent fixture of American life. The presence of the U.S. military overseas was not just about power. It was about perception. Every base, every outpost, became a symbol of America's commitment to resisting the spread of communism. The Cold War transformed these installations into more than just military bases. They became the cornerstones of American global influence, each one a silent outpost in the battle for the world's ideological soul. In the face of political uncertainty, America's footprint stretched further, evolving from wartime necessity to Cold War dominance. But at what cost? By the end of the 1940s, the United States had not only survived the Second World War, but had solidified its place as the most powerful nation on Earth. The military bases built during the war, initially designed for a global conflict, were now redefined as part of America's Cold War strategy. These bases were no longer simply tools of war. They became symbols of American power and influence, extending the U.S.'s reach to every corner of the globe. The U.S. military footprint evolved from a patchwork of wartime necessities to a network of strategic positions that spanned continents. From the Caribbean to the Pacific, from Europe to the Middle East, these bases became the backbone of America's ability to project power across the globe. They were not just military installations. They were outposts in a new global struggle. The political landscape was shifting, and the U.S. needed a military presence to secure its interests and contain Soviet influence. The long-term cost of this global presence was immense. The maintenance of these bases, the logistics of supply lines, the political negotiations with host nations, all of these factors weighed heavily on the American government. But despite the cost, the strategic value of these installations remained clear. They were more than just outposts of military might. They were symbols of America's role as the global leader in the fight against communism. And as the Cold War deepened, America's global footprint would only continue to grow. The war ended, but the remnants of the past still linger, on forgotten islands, in abandoned bases, and in the cultural shifts they ignited. The legacy of the post-war military bases is complex. While many were closed or transformed into civilian sites, the remnants of the wartime infrastructure remain embedded in the landscape. Abandoned Quonset huts, decaying airstrips, and rusting military vehicles still. The Pacific Islands, silent witnesses to a war that shaped the course of history. Some of these sites have been reclaimed by nature, their concrete foundations slowly crumbling under the weight of time. But the impact of these bases extends far beyond their physical remnants. The social and cultural shifts they ignited in local communities are profound. In many places, American military presence transformed local economies, cultures, and societies. From the Philippines to Guam, entire communities were built around the military installations that once served as the backbone of American power. As these bases closed or reduced their presence, the cultural and economic implications were felt for generations. The environmental legacy of these bases is just as significant. Fuel tanks left behind leached into the ground, creating contamination that would take decades to clean up. The once pristine landscapes now bear the scars of war. But despite the environmental toll, the geopolitical impact of these bases cannot be overstated. They shaped modern geopolitics, providing the foundation for American influence that endures to this day. The legacy of the war machine is not just a history of military might. It is a history of transformation, of power, and of loss. These bases, once symbols of American dominance, now stand as reminders of the complex, multifaceted nature of warfare, peace, and global influence. Their stories are woven into the fabric of American history, and their impact will continue to shape the world for generations to come. In the end, the war was never truly over. It had simply changed form, leaving behind a world where the ghosts of military dominance continue to haunt the global stage, long after the final shots were fired. The empire of military bases, with its echoes of conflict and power, will never fully fade from the world's memory. Because, as history has shown, power never truly disappears. It only changes shape.